Hello Varlets. This is a continuation from the first State of the Game video I released some time earlier. In that one, I summarized Darktide's timeline 6 months after it launched and also gave whether or not I recommend picking up or coming back to Darktide. In this video, I'll be covering what Fatshark can reasonably do to get Darktide back into a good place, given all the ups and downs the game has been facing. While topics like this have definitely been talked about by other content creators and on the Darktide Reddit, I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to be giving suggestions about what can be done realistically and in a way that doesn't go against what Fatshark has intended Darktide to be, based on their so-called design philosophy of the game. As it stands right now, practically every core system in the game is to be determined by RNG with minimal player agency. Whether it comes to farming loot, choosing the maps we want, designing and enhancing our arsenal, RNG is involved in it all. This has led to a great deal of frustration where players can come onto Darktide, play for hours to farm materials and weapons, take them all to Hadron and wind up with nothing to show for it. Even after spending so much time in the game, a player can end their gaming session with literally no change to their progression at all. This to me is the greatest sin of their design philosophy. A slot machine masquerading as a means of player progression with no respect for time or effort put in. So, to be clear, I am no fan of their current progression system as it stands. However, because this is their design philosophy they have chosen, and they don't seem to want to move away from it for whatever reason, the suggestions I have proposed here have to follow one rule. It can't violate the RNG design Fatshark has implemented into the game. Many good and great suggestions I have heard almost always tend to violate this rule, which basically means it's never going to happen, though I would absolutely be alright being wrong about this. Moving on. The current state of the game has created a couple of problems for both us, the players, and Fatshark. These problems are, number 1, RNG frustration, which has led to a declining player retention, and number 2, a lack of revitalizing content, which has led to players outright leaving the game and is also contributing towards a wavering player retention. Starting with addressing RNG frustration, if Fatshark is hellbent on keeping RNG in the game in the form of perk and blessing locks, as well as randomized weapon acquisition, the best thing they can do to meet players in the middle is to reduce the frustration that comes with an RNG-based system, and that is to make the engaging with the system itself very easy to do by lowering the barriers of participation. Since RNG is tied to our weapon progression, and our weapon progression requires materials and dockets, making material and docket acquisition much more rewarding than it is now is an easy start. I know in one of the patches they already increased the amount of resources we can collect from missions by a pretty sizable amount, but this is not enough. With the current setup, on average, it takes about 2 and a bit of regular damnation clears to have enough plasteel to fully upgrade a weapon from white to orange. If you spend on average 24 minutes clearing a damnation mission and picking up everything along the way, every weapon upgrade you do from scratch will require you to invest about 72 minutes or about an hour and 10 minutes of your game time, not counting loading times or failed runs. To this, I propose that plasteel gain across all difficulties be increased by 1.5 times. Why 1.5? Because this multiplier allows you to fully upgrade blue weapons you purchase from the armory in a way that scales very nicely with difficulty. Let me explain. The maximum plasteel cost for upgrading a blue weapon to orange is 1100 plasteel. By multiplying existing max plasteel rates for each of the core difficulties by 1.5, we arrive at this progression rate. So, as you can see, this multiplier makes it so that accumulating the necessary quantities of plasteel is more forgiving for all players in all core difficulties, reducing the games you need by about 50% on average. However, this rewards skilled players with better farming efficiency for taking on tougher missions. Being able to meaningfully engage in crafting related activities after every mission makes our progression feel much more tangible, whereas with the current system, if you only had an hour or an hour and a half to play, you do nothing but try to farm resources, only to blow it all on a bricked weapon, then basically waste your gaming session getting nowhere and feeling no different than you started, like I mentioned. This alone won't solve that problem, but generosity in this regard takes the sting out of bad RNG a little. Plus, players love seeing large amount of resources collected. That's an added level of satisfaction Fatshark can provide for free by being generous when it comes to resource farming. Just don't pull a dick move and increase upgrade costs as well. That's a very good way to draw ire from everyone in an instant. The same can be done for Diamantine as well. Of course, one of the main problems with Diamantine is that we often have too much of it and nowhere to spend it meaningfully, but I'll get to that in a bit. In addition to implementing this multiplier to pickups, Fatshark can also include a bonus modifier for missions that have conditions attached. This is already done for auto dockets. When you complete a mission with conditions or pick up books, you get more dockets for successfully finishing them. Something to the tune of 5 to 20% bonus materials depending on the condition would probably be good enough to entice players to take on these harder missions. The final piece of the resource puzzle is to make it so that bartering a weapon also gives you a tiny amount of resources. The amount you get will depend on the rarity of the weapon, and it could look something like this. Having this system in place removes a little more of the sting of bad RNG when rolling your weapons. But more importantly, it also makes weapons that you get from completing missions worth a little something when they would have otherwise been entirely worthless to you. With these 3 suggestions in place, we've made the grinding loop to participate in the RNG itemization process much more accessible and much less frustrating to engage in. By allowing players to amass a meaningful amount of resources through effort spent and time invested, it opens up other avenues where they can spend their resources on making meaningful progress in their itemization. This is where we bring back the topic of having too much diamantine into the picture. Because the ratio of diamantine to plasteel collected doesn't match the amount you need to spend for weapon enhancement, over time, players will find themselves with an excess of diamantine collecting in their inventory. One of the simplest solutions often suggested by players was to allow them to convert diamantine into plasteel, like how Fatshark allowed different tiers of dust to be traded down in Vermintide 2. Another suggestion talked about was to let us use diamantine to upgrade blessings and perks, or to pay to break open the locks on a weapon perk or blessing. But as I've mentioned, any real suggestion has to work without diminishing the actual RNG systems, so here's what I propose. Let us use diamantine to reroll all of our weapons, perks and blessings once without imposing any locks. This shall be called Re-Sanctify, and this is how it would work. Let's say you've got a random orange weapon and haven't altered any of its perks or blessings, but unhappy with the outcome. Normally you'd brick this weapon and barter it away, or try to make it suck less by tweaking it through refine and rebless options. With Re-Sanctify, you can spend something like 100 or 150 diamantine, depending on item rarity, to refresh the individual perks and blessings of the weapon one time without placing any locks on them. This essentially simulates getting a new orange weapon again, but can be used as a last chance to try and get the perk or blessing combinations that you want. This is especially useful for trying to salvage a weapon that has really nice base stats but a terrible combination of perks or blessings. On top of that, this system already exists in the current way we reroll perks and choose blessings for extraction. All that needs to be done is to duplicate the system, change the resource cost, and restrict its usage on perks and blessings that have already been re-sanctified. With this in place, it means that as long as you have the requisite amount of diamantine to spend, you basically have double weapon drops, as each drop has a possible second roll to it. This indirectly increases the value of weapons you get from Emperor's Gifts, from Milk, and the store, but also provides players a little more agency without tampering with the RNG system in place, while also increasing the value of diamantine as well. All in all, with these suggestions, the progression loop is largely the same as it was, but it's now much more respectful of a player's effort and time invested than the current system, and accomplished largely through numerical changes or duplicating existing systems. I'll say it again. My suggestions here are to reduce the frustration with the existing system while abiding by Fatshark's RNG design. I would love for our progression system to be like that of DRG, where we can just stick overclocks into weapons and create a fundamental change in how it works and feels, and be able to swap between various stats as and when we feel like it after we unlock it for the first time. The next thing we can look to do to retain what's left of the player base is to address the RNG involved in choosing maps and the level of difficulty they want to fight at. The current map system is often compared to how DRG does it. The map choice itself rotates with different modifiers, but players are able to choose the difficulty they want to play at. On top of this, DRG maps are never the same despite being on the same biome. This gives DRG maps a tremendous amount of replayability, since you can never predict how a map is going to look and feel until you're actually in the mission itself. The key difference between DRG being able to do this while Darktide can't is simple. DRG is peer-to-peer hosting, whereas Darktide is hosted by dedicated servers. If everyone in Darktide wanted to pick their own map and difficulty, I'm pretty sure the server capacity that Fatshark has would probably die. Well, maybe not with the existing size of the player base. This is also probably the main reason why solo mode is not available either. They'd have to dedicate server bandwidth to host a single instance of a game for just one person. Now, I'm no network engineer or know anything about what it takes to host games and server stuff, but from a business point of view, with the way Fatshark has things set up, it seems like enabling this function is going to be more costly perhaps, and that's probably why nothing is being done about it yet. So, given these constraints, which again, I may be wrong about, please correct me in the comments if I am, how do we fix the existing map rotation system without tampering with the RNG system in place or placing additional burdens on Fatshark's server capacity? First, let's lay out the key frustrations players are having with the existing system. The first is that there are no maps with the difficulty or challenge that they want to play on. The second one is that maps that do have the difficulty they want to play on have conditions that they don't want to engage with, like low intensity or power outage. So with these pain points in mind, what can Fatshark do with minimal effort to vastly improve the player experience? Currently, Darktide has 16 maps on rotation that vary in 5 levels of difficulty, but is skewed towards the higher difficulties like Heresy and Damnation. On top of this, there is a global condition that rotates which affects many maps, but also map-specific conditions which affect only that particular map. The first thing we can do is to combine Uprising and Sedition difficulties together, but rebalance it to be forgiving for new players still learning the game. In addition, only 3 maps of the 16 available should be enabled for this difficulty level. Because low-level maps rotate every 15 minutes, by the time a new player does the available maps, they should have rotated into different ones when they make it back, if they make it back. With a difficulty dedicated to new players, we now have 13 maps left to make the gaming experience better for the more seasoned players. For the hardest of the hardcore players who only want to face overwhelming odds, there should be a single permanent map tile called Deathrun. Players who opt to get into Deathrun missions will be deployed into a random Damnation level map with high intensity Shock Trooper Gauntlet condition active. This map tile is always active and provides a bonus multiplier on all of the docklets and resources they manage to pick up upon successful mission completion. Having this dedicated map tile keeps the hardcore player base together while ensuring they will always have something to do no matter when they come on. This gives us 12 more maps to work with, and with that we will form the bulk of our core player experience. For this, the remaining difficulties of Malice, Heresy and Damnation should get 4 maps each and have a rotation timer of 20 minutes, which is about the combined average completion time across the different difficulties. Of these 4 maps, one of them will be affected by the current global condition, one of them will have a random specific condition attached to them, and the other 2 will be regular missions. This suggestion makes use of the current system already in place, but reduces the frustration involved in not being able to play what you want to an extent. So, with these suggestions in place, here's a mockup I made to show you what our new mission board might look like. Given that the map rotation system is more complex and complicated to figure out, this was the best suggestion I could come up with to make just wanting to play the game a little less frustrating. I know back in Vermintide 2 we had deeds that we could spend to modify the difficulty of the mission with some crazy modifiers like permadeath or endless hordes or all the ads are now elites, but again, because of how Darktide has been set up, player-specific modifiers is going to be more complicated or costly to implement. Next up, let's address the problem about the lack of revitalizing content to improve player retention and acquisition. When I think about what content is, I think of things that I can do. New game modes, new maps, new missions, new subclasses, and new weapons would be things that I can do in Darktide. While we have had an infusion of weapons as well as a handful of maps introduced in the past 6 months, I think Darktide hasn't reached a tipping point of content where we have enough variety to mix things up and keep things fresh. While of course I'd love nothing more than having new subclasses to play with and even newer game mode to be introduced, I think there are technical or business reasons for why these pieces of content aren't being deployed as fast as they should be. So, given these restrictions again, what can Fatshark do with what they've got in the tank at the moment? The first step to introducing revitalizing content is to first look at what pieces of content aren't being engaged with as much or are outright being neglected. In my opinion, these come in the form of certain class feats never being touched and an entire bunch of weapons and blessings being left in the dust because they are too weak or have no good reason to ever use them. Simply tweaking some numbers or minor reworks towards certain tipping points will open up build crafting options and give players more variety to play with without feeling they are actively handicapping the team. While I love to talk about balancing suggestions to class feats, weapons and blessings, I think I'll cover all of this in a separate video. In the meantime, we can take a page out from DRG and string together a bunch of missions for a reward at the end or in between missions. This could be a weekly thing that players do for some progress towards their itemization. For example, these missions, which I'll call contract operations, could come from Melk and would look something like this. There will be a special map tile on the mission board where players can quick play into. Starting the mission on your own or quick playing will load you into the map you need to complete next, which will be tracked on the mission board itself. This suggestion would require a new system to be implemented, but the core bits that go into it have already been established. It would just be a matter of making them sequential and adjusting the rewards for them. What's more, if this system ever gets established, Fatshark can really go all out on making more engaging things to do to test their player base. For example, they could make an emergency special ops mission that appears every Friday evening and lasts till reset. This is similar to Trials of Osiris from Destiny 2. This mission set is meant for the toughest of the tough and will push your skills to the limit, all for a bountiful reward at the end of course. Emergency Special Ops or ESOs could look something like this. I know it's an eyeful, but please pause if you'd like to read what my imagination has decided to come up with. Here's the emergency hazard table in detail. Practically all of these modifiers have been lifted from Vermintide 2's deed system. It's just a case of messing with the AI director in Darktide to do the same during ESOs. As you can see, this special mission system can get really crazy with the modifiers you have to deal with, but can also be extremely rewarding for players who want to push themselves to the edge of their skill level. The benefit of making it difficulty based is so even lower skilled players or players who aren't very familiar with the game can also participate in this madness and enjoy the rewards that come with it. No one is locked out from playing ESO missions, and it helps to draw in players to play over the weekend. Though implementing reasonable requirements to unlock the higher level of difficulties in ESOs might be a good idea to prevent deadweight players from coming in. Fun systems like this will give players more reasons to turn on Darktide and play, but this alone won't address any of the fundamental issues with progression or staleness. It's still technically doing the same thing after all, except now you're giving players a very compelling reason to do them through generous loot. Okay. I think I've said my piece about the suggestions that could realistically be implemented into the game, with no disruptions towards the existing RNG system, while also reducing player frustrations. These ideas and suggestions were made with the intent that maybe, just maybe, someone from Fatshark is watching my stuff and this video gives them an idea or two that we might see down the line. Better to have made it and failed than to have not and wondered forever, I guess. Let's talk about some of the ideas Fatshark implement with minimal effort that would put the game in a much better space in the comments below. Remember, for one reason or another, it cannot violate their RNG design. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Varlets.